What if the sacred laws we often associate with Moses and the Ten Commandments were not born on Mount Sinai, but whispered into the soul of humanity long before stone ever touched flame, hidden within forbidden texts like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, once revered yet silenced by the guardians of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, lies a deeper truth. These divine decrees were not first given to Moses, but to Adam himself in the twilight breath of creation, when the universe was still tender and veiled in mystery. From Adam to Noah, from Abraham to Moses, these celestial codes moved like a secret river beneath the sands of time, shaping the unseen covenant between humanity and the divine. Yet somewhere along the way, the fuller tale was veiled, lost in smoke and sacred silence. You may recall the ancient command in Genesis, "Do not eat from the tree of knowledge," and the early sacrifices of Cain and Abel. But what if these were not the beginnings but echoes of something more ancient, more arcane? The Book of Jubilees dares to unveil what mainstream texts conceal, that Adam was taught the mysteries of the Sabbath, the sacred laws of sacrifice and the rituals of purity long before tablets were carved or commandments proclaimed. A hidden legacy encoded not in stone, but in the soul. The fact that these commandments were handed down from generation to generation demonstrates that Moses was not receiving new laws, but rather providing a formalization of an ancient custom. Today's video will take a deep dive into the hidden information that can be discovered in the prohibited books, and we will compare it to the tales that are contained in the Bible itself. As an illustration, the Book of Jubilees elaborates on the fact that Noah erected an altar and offered sacrifices after the flood, as stated in Genesis 8:20. This is because the Book of Jubilees explains that Noah was adhering to the same regulations of sacrifice purity and the Sabbath that had been handed down from Adam. This collection of novels reveals a profound reality. From the very beginning, the laws that were eventually written by Moses have been in existence, and they have served as a guide for all of humanity. Continue reading if you are interested in finding out more about the ways in which these ancient laws influence the lives of Abraham, Noah, and Adam. In addition, if you find this subject matter to be interesting, please remember to give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Deep Bible Stories. We have also discussed other works that are prohibited from being read, such as the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. Examine the description for the movies and links that are referred to. As the first human being to be placed in the Garden of Eden and given the instruction by God to refrain from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam is presented to us in the Bible for the first time in Genesis 2:16 around 17. On the other hand, were you aware that the Book of Jubilees and other forbidden manuscripts claim that Adam was given a much more comprehensive collection of divine laws that would serve to direct the relationship between humanity and God for many generations to come? In the books that were banned, Adam was not only the first man, but he was also the first person to enforce the law. He was entrusted with sacred commandments that were passed down via his generations. These commandments comprise fundamental principles such as the Sabbath laws of sacrifice and the maintenance of purity in front of God. We are going to dissect these ancient laws and see how they are connected to the information that we have learned from the Bible. The concept of the Sabbath can be traced back to the book of Genesis, which describes how God rested on the seventh day after creating the heavens and the world. Genesis 2:2-3. When Moses finally gets his hands on the Ten Commandments, the Israelites are given the instruction to observe the Sabbath as a holy day, which is found in Exodus 28:11. On the other hand, the Book of Jubilees, specifically Jubilees 2:17-24, reveals that the concept of the Sabbath was not a novel one that originated with Moses. Instead, Adam was the one who initially came up with the idea. Not only was it a law that applied to Israel, but it was also a law that applied to all of humanity. God gave Adam the command to observe the Sabbath as a day of worship and rest, and over the decades, this holy tradition has been passed down from generation to generation. Because of this, the Sabbath is much more than just a ritual from the Israelites. For the purpose of reminding humanity that God is the creator and of assisting us in taking a break from our labor and re-establishing a connection with his divine rhythm, it was intended for all people beginning with Adam. Even though it is a day of rest, the Sabbath is more of a spiritual discipline than anything else. It serves as a reminder that we are a part of the creation that God has made and that we ought to respect Him by pausing, reflecting, and honoring Him. In order to keep an intimate relationship with God, it was necessary to observe the Sabbath as stated in the writings that were prohibited. The fact that the failure to observe the Sabbath in Jubilees resulted in spiritual upheaval demonstrates that this practice was intentional from the very beginning in order to maintain humanity's alignment with the divine order that God had established. There is more to the Sabbath than simply avoiding labor, according to both the Bible and the publications that are forbidden. A method to engage in spiritual renewal, a means to recall that God is the Creator and that we are His people, is to do so through this practice. Were you taken aback when you found out that Adam was the one who was granted the Sabbath? The way you think about the Sabbath is altered as a result of this realization. In the comments section below, please share your ideas with us. In the beginning of the Bible, the idea of making a sacrifice is mentioned. It is written in Genesis that Cain and Abel offered sacrifices to God. Nevertheless, we do not receive a great deal of information regarding the reasons for or the locations where they learned this practice. Genesis 4:3-4. On the other hand, according to Jubilees 3:27 of the Book of Jubilees, Adam was the first person to offer sacrifices in accordance with the instructions given by God after the fall. In addition to demonstrating adoration and obedience to God, these sacrifices served as a means of atoning for sin. The texts that were declared illegal depicted sacrifices as more than merely offerings. Rather, they were profoundly symbolic acts of reconciliation between humanity and God. They were a symbol of the restoration of the connection that had been harmed by sin. The sacrifices that Adam offered served as a precedent for the sacrifices that would eventually be mandated by the Levitical regulations that Moses enacted, which may be seen in Leviticus 1:7. Despite the fact that the Bible provides in-depth instructions on the many kinds of gifts that were made during the time of Moses, Jubilees demonstrates that these laws were not completely novel. The divine system that was founded with Adam included them as a component. At the same time that the book of Genesis depicts Cain and Abel presenting offerings to God, the book of Jubilees indicates that the act of offering sacrifices was a divine command that was given to Adam. This practice was then passed down through the generations to Noah, Abraham, and eventually to Moses. When you think about purity regulations, your mind may immediately go to the book of Leviticus. In this book, the Israelites were given specific instructions on how to maintain a holy and ritually clean lifestyle. What if, on the other hand, these regulations protecting purity were genuinely handed down from Adam himself? In the book of Jubilees, chapter 3, verses 3-14, it is stated that after the fall, God instructed Adam in the laws of purity, which instructed him on how to live a holy life and maintain a spiritually pure state in front of God. These restrictions were not only concerned with maintaining a clean appearance. Keeping a state of spiritual purity was the focus of these teachings, which would subsequently be expanded upon by the law. For the sake of preserving a connection with God, purity was absolutely necessary. The regulations of purity included everything from marriage to sacrificial offerings, and they were designed to ensure that Adam and his successors would be able to approach God in a condition of sanctity. In spite of the fact that the Levitical rule gives a more in-depth description of these behaviors, in Leviticus 11:15, the books that were banned demonstrate that Adam had already been following these principles for a considerable amount of time before Moses. We now have a more comprehensive understanding of the reasons why purity was so important throughout the Bible. It wasn't merely a matter of being required by religion. One may live their lives in a manner that was spiritually in harmony with the will of God. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 1-7, the Bible explains that Adam and Eve's eyes were open to the concept of sin, as well as to the fact that they were naked when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The book of Enoch, on the other hand, demonstrates that this knowledge was significantly profound. It required having a consciousness of the spiritual conflict between good and evil, which started when the Watchers, who were fallen angels, contaminated the earth they were living on. At the beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve were made aware of their sin and their need for redemption when they gained knowledge of both good and evil. However, this is expanded upon in the works that have been prohibited, which demonstrate that Adam became aware of the cosmic fight between good and evil, which included fallen angels and demonic forces that wanted to lead humanity astray. The spiritual conflict that would come to define the rest of human history is brought to light by this more comprehensive viewpoint. This is a topic that is present throughout the Bible, but it is dwelt upon significantly in the Book of Enoch. Nasur became the key character through whom God would renew his laws and rebuild order on earth after the cataclysmic flood washed out the corruption that had engulfed the planet. This occurred after the worldwide corruption had been eradicated. As stated in Genesis 6:9, the Bible explains that Noah was selected because he was a righteous individual throughout his time period. Are you aware, however, that the writings that have been prohibited from circulation, in particular the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, contain more profound and spiritual information regarding the laws that Noah was required to enforce? With the help of these laws, humanity was able to once again live in accordance with the divine order that God had established. In this section, we will investigate how Noah received these divine regulations and passed them on to his successors. In doing so, he ensured that the commandments that were initially given to Adam remained to influence the connection that humanity had with God. In the Bible, we learn that one of the first things that Noah did after the deluge was to construct an altar and give sacrifices to God, Genesis 8:20. God was pleased with this contribution, and as a result, he formed a covenant with Noah, vowing that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood, as described in Genesis 9:11. On the other hand, the Bible does not elaborate on the circumstances under which Noah learned to offer these sacrifices. In the Book of Jubilees, chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, it is stated that God instructed Noah in the tradition of offering sacrifices, just as he had instructed Adam. The practice of sacrifice was more than just a ritual in the books that were prohibited from being read. It was an essential component in the process of preserving the connection that existed between God and humans. It was through the offering of sacrifices that Noah was able to carry on the covenant that had been established with Adam and ensure that his descendants would be in a position of acceptance with God. As a means of making up for the sin that had initially led to the occurrence of the flood, these sacrifices performed were offered. Despite the fact that the Bible only makes a passing reference to Noah's altar and sacrifice in Genesis 8 and 20, the Book of Jubilees elaborates on this practice by demonstrating that these sacrifices were an old custom that was carried down from Adam. It was not something that Noah had created. Rather, it was a component of the divine system that had been in existence ever since the initial creation of the earth. It was through the act of providing sacrifices that order was brought back into the world following the turmoil caused by the flood. This was done to ensure that God's blessings would continue to be bestowed upon future generations. Are you aware that the sacrifices that Noah made were a part of an ancient law that was given to Adam? Which aspects of your understanding of sacrifice in the Bible are altered as a result of this? Post your thoughts in the comments section below. Following the deluge, God gave Noah the command to repopulate the earth. However, this was not only about ensuring the earth's physical survival, it was also about reviving the earth's spirit. In the Book of Jubilees, chapter 7, verses 23 through 30, God is said to have given Noah special purity standards in order to guarantee that the new humanity would continue to be holy and escape the corruption that had led to the deluge. From sexual purity to avoiding contact with the Nephilim, the descendants of fallen angels who had spread evil throughout the earth, these regulations covered everything from sexual purity to avoiding contact with the Nephilim. In Genesis 9, 1-4, God instructs Noah and his descendants to avoid ingesting blood as part of their diet and to be fruitful and multiply. Other instructions include avoiding the consumption of blood. The Levitical purity laws that were revealed to Moses, which can be found in Leviticus 17, 10-14, elaborate on the need of keeping purity and valuing life. This commandment about blood emphasizes the value of both of these activities. On the other hand, the writings that have been forbidden include a great deal more information demonstrating that Noah was given instructions on how to live a holy life. This was done to ensure that the world that had been flooded would not return to the same level of evil as it had been previously. The purity laws found in the Book of Jubilees extend beyond the concept of physical cleanliness. They were designed to ensure that Noah and his successors maintained their spiritual purity, particularly in their interactions with one another and in their worship. Noah was given the instruction to abstain from any acts that could be considered defiling, including marriage with the Nephilim, who were descendants of the fallen angels. This was very necessary in order to preserve the holiness of the world and to guarantee that God would continue to reward Noah's family. In spite of the fact that the Bible provides us with the fundamental principles of chastity, the works that are prohibited expand upon this to demonstrate that these regulations were a part of a much greater conflict between good and evil. All of Noah's descendants were to steer clear of the corruption that had been plaguing the earth prior to the flood. This was done to ensure that they would continue to have a good connection with God. It was commanded to Noah that he observe the Sabbath just as it was commanded to Adam. In the Book of Jubilees, chapter 6, verses 23-30, it is emphasized that the Sabbath was not only for the people of Israel. It was a law that was passed down from Adam to Noah and his descendants, and it was applicable to all of humanity. It is not expressly said in the Bible that Noah observed the Sabbath, but we do see the significance of the Sabbath later on when God reveals the law to Moses in Exodus 28:11. In the writings that are prohibited, the Sabbath is portrayed as a global law that is intended to be respected by all individuals as a means of paying respect to the creation that God has made. Rest was not the only purpose of the Sabbath. It was also a means of ensuring that mankind remained in harmony with the divine plan of God. The Book of Jubilees states that after the flood, Noah and his descendants were reminded to observe the Sabbath as a demonstration of their continued allegiance to God. This was done as soon as possible after the deluge. As described in Genesis and subsequently in Exodus, the Sabbath is a day of rest that is a reflection of the seventh day of creation, which was the day that God allowed himself to rest. On the other hand, the books that were prohibited demonstrate that this practice was not only a component of the Mosaic rule. Long before Moses was born, Noah was given the instruction to observe this particular thing. The Sabbath was a practice that was intended to assist humanity in maintaining its connection to the divine order. Its purpose was to preserve the spiritual rhythm that had been established at the beginning of time. Genesis 9:11 informs us that after the flood, God formed a covenant with Noah, guaranteeing that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. This covenant was sealed after the flood. On the other hand, the Book of Enoch presents evidence that Noah lived in a world in which spiritual battle was still very much a reality. The Watchers, also known as fallen angels, were responsible for the corruption of humanity prior to the deluge. Following their defeat, the spirits of their offspring, known as the Nephilim, dispersed across the earth as malevolent spirits. Despite the fact that the Bible is primarily concerned with the covenant that God made with Noah, the books that Noah was aware of the ongoing spiritual conflict are prohibited. It is revealed in the Book of Enoch that Noah and his successors were required to maintain vigilance in order to protect themselves from the impact of these evil spirits that were attempting to mislead humanity. In the Bible, Noah is depicted as a good and obedient individual who faithfully carries out the orders of God. However, in the writings that are prohibited, Noah is also revealed to be a significant figure in the spiritual conflict that started with Adam. Not only was he doing the physical reconstruction of humanity, but he was also leading the charge in the battle against the evil spirits that continued to afflict the earth. In light of the fact that Noah was aware of the existence of both good and evil, he was entrusted with the responsibility of ensuring that his family maintained a spiritual purity, resisted the influence of the Nephilim, and remained true to God. As we approach Abraham, we enter a crucial period in the history of the Bible. In addition to receiving tremendous promises from God, such as promises of progeny and a homeland, Abraham also inherited the divine laws that had been handed down from Adam and Noah via their successors. According to the Bible, Abraham is referred to as the father of faith. However, the writings that have been forbidden disclose additional depths of the covenant, demonstrating that Abraham was entrusted with these ancient laws to mold his family and ultimately the entire country of Israel. In this section, we will investigate how the commandments of circumcision, sacrifice purity, and the Sabbath were not new when they were given to Abraham. Rather, they were a part of a long-standing tradition that tied him to the divine plan that had been planned out for humanity from the very beginning. When God creates a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, he tells Abraham that all males in his household must be circumcised as a sign of the covenant. This is the first time that the law of circumcision is mentioned in the Bible. However, the Book of Jubilees, which covers the years 1525-34, states that this was not the first time that circumcision was performed in the history of the world. It had been a part of an ancient law that Adam and Noah had been following for a very long time, before Abraham was given the command to carry it out. In the book of Genesis chapter 17, God gives Abraham the instruction to circumcise all of the males in his household. This is done so that his descendants will be recognized as God's chosen people. That Abraham's family had a special relationship with God was demonstrated by the fact that they were circumcised, which set them apart from the other nations in the area. However, the books that were banned go into greater detail about this topic, demonstrating that circumcision was not only a physical act, but also a spiritual commitment. According to the Book of Jubilees, the practice had already been given to Adam and Noah as a proof of their obedience to the law that God had established. Abraham's obedience was considered as a continuation of the original plan that began with Adam. This was because Abraham was renewing an ancient covenant by re-establishing this practice. Therefore, while the book of Genesis presents circumcision as a new covenant between God and Abraham, the writings that have been banned from the country inform us that Abraham was actually restoring a divine law that had been in place for many generations. The practice of circumcision was not a custom that was exclusive to Israel. It was a law that applied to all of humanity and was universal in scope. A moment that stands out as particularly significant in the narrative of Abraham is the offering of Isaac as a sacrifice in Genesis 22. However, according to the texts that were forbidden, the idea of offering a sacrifice was not something that was novel at the time. This event is frequently regarded as the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. In the ancient practice of presenting sacrifices, which had been started by Adam and Noah, Abraham was carrying on the tradition. Abraham is given the command by God in Genesis 22 to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice by means of a burnt offering. Abraham's willingness to accept even the most difficult command is a great demonstration of his trust in God, and this event is a powerful show of that trust. But according to Jubilees 18:09-18, this event is tied to the old law of sacrifice that had been handed down from generation to generation. This law had been passed down from generation to generation. In order to make amends for his sins and to demonstrate his love to God, Abraham was already familiar with the tradition of presenting sacrifices to their deity. The publications that have been prohibited go much further by demonstrating that Abraham's willingness to almost sacrifice Isaac was a continuation of the divine commandment that was given to Adam and Noah. In this particular setting, the act of sacrificing was not a singular occurrence. It was a part of a tradition that had been going on for such a long time that it signified surrender to the will of God and the renewing of the covenant that humanity had with the Creator. Despite the fact that the Bible concentrates on Abraham's test of faith, the writings that are prohibited from being read provide us with a more profound comprehension of the significance of sacrifice. Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac as a sacrifice was an act of total obedience, as it was in accordance with a law that had been in effect from the beginning of time. There is a major emphasis placed on the laws of purity, which are regulations that govern cleanliness and holiness throughout the Bible, particularly in the Levitical law that was delivered to Moses. However, were you aware that Abraham had already been putting these rules into practice for a considerable amount of time before they were formally documented? It is written in the Book of Jubilees, namely in chapters 21-7, that God gave Abraham explicit instructions on how to live a life of purity and how to pass these commandments on to his descendants. Despite the fact that the book of Genesis does not contain any specific purity requirements, the books that were forbidden revealed that Abraham was extremely concerned about the holiness of his household. In the Book of Jubilees, Abraham was commanded to avoid intermarriage with the Canaanites, whose activities were considered defiling. These standards of purity were designed to ensure a holy lineage, ensuring that Abraham's descendants would remain obedient to God. While the Bible presents specific purity standards from the time of Moses, the prohibited texts reveal that Abraham was already following these ideas. He ensured that his family obeyed to laws concerning marriage hygiene and ceremonial purity as a method to keep in good standing with God. For Abraham, these commandments were not merely about external purity. They were about protecting the holiness of the covenant people. It was imperative that these regulations, which had been handed down from Adam and Noah, be followed in order to preserve the holiness of the country that would eventually become Israel. The mandate to observe the Sabbath was given to Abraham just as it was to Adam and that of Noah. It is made abundantly apparent in the Book of Jubilees, namely in Jubilees 56:13, that the Sabbath was not merely a law for Israel. Having existed ever since the beginning of creation, it was a law that applied to everyone and everything. Although it is not specifically mentioned in the Bible that Abraham observed the Sabbath, the writings that have been barred from circulation provide evidence that Abraham was a devout observer of this holy day. In what ways was the Sabbath observed, and what does its meaning entail? As the day on which God rested after creating the world, the Sabbath is first mentioned in the book of Genesis, specifically in verses 2 and 3. In later years, the Mosaic Law establishes it as a day of rest for the Israelites, specifically in Exodus 28:11. Nevertheless, the texts that were prohibited to be read assert that the Sabbath was already an essential component of the divine law that Abraham adhered to. According to the Book of Jubilees, Abraham kept the Sabbath as a means of preserving his link to the divine order that had been created at the time of creation. When it came to Abraham, the Sabbath meant more than just a day of rest for his body. It was a moment for rekindling one's spirituality and contemplating the covenant that God had made. The Sabbath is portrayed as a cosmic commandment in the texts that are prohibited, and it is said that even the angels in heaven respect it. Through the practice of observing the Sabbath, Abraham was able to connect himself with the everlasting purpose of God. He was also able to carry on the tradition that had been passed down from Adam and Noah. We have arrived at the point in time when the divine laws that have been handed down from Adam, Noah, and Abraham are properly defined and written down in the Torah. This moment is when we come to Moses. Many of the laws that were handed to Moses on Mount Sinai were not completely original according to the texts that were forbidden, despite the fact that Moses is commonly regarded as the greatest lawgiver. They were a part of the ancient laws that had directed humanity ever since the beginning of time, laws that were finally organized and made official for the country of Israel. There is a good chance that the Ten Commandments are the most well-known portion of the Mosaic Law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai in Exodus 20. A covenant between God and the Israelites is built on these 10 principles, which span everything from worship to moral behavior. These principles constitute the cornerstone of the covenant. However, the books that were prohibited from being read, such as the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, stated that many of these rules were not brand new. From the beginning of time, they had been a part of the law that God had established. The Ten Commandments are presented in Exodus 20 as a fresh covenant between God and Israel. Nevertheless, the books that are prohibited from being read teach us that these principles have been observed by the righteous from the time of Adam. An example of this would be the mandate to observe the Sabbath, which had already been given to Adam and Noah. Additionally, the commandments that prohibit committing murder, theft, and adultery were a part of the moral code that was provided to Abraham. In the Book of Jubilees, specifically in verses 23 and 24, it is emphasized that these commandments were a part of the everlasting design and that they have been directing humanity ever since the earth was created. It was Moses who established the 10 Commandments, which were a renewal of the ancient law. The purpose of these commandments was to bring the Israelites back into conformity with the original design that God initially had for humanity. Within the parameters of this discussion, Moses was not constructing a whole new legal system. He was carrying on the divine tradition that had been started by Adam and had been followed by the devout ever since it had been established. The establishment of these ancient regulations for the people of Israel was merely the next stage, and the 10 Commandments were the result of that process. What adjustments do you make to your perspective on the 10 Commandments now that you are aware that they were part of an old tradition? Do you believe that their relevance has increased even further now? In the comments section, please share your ideas. The practice of keeping the Sabbath is one of the most important aspects of the Mosaic Law. Nevertheless, the books that were forbidden to be read demonstrate that this custom was not exclusive to Moses or even the Israelites. According to the Book of Jubilees, the Sabbath was a part of the divine order that God created at the time of the creation of the world and was passed down from generation to generation as stated in the book. In Exodus 28:11, the Israelites are given the instruction to observe the Sabbath as a day of rest, a day to contemplate the creation that God has made, and a day to refrain from any and all forms of labor. However, the texts that are prohibited from being read state that Adam, Noah, and Abraham had already observed the Sabbath prior to Moses receiving the law at Mount Sinai by Moses. The Book of Jubilees, namely chapters 56 to 13, presents the Sabbath as a cosmic law that is honored not just by people on earth, but also by angels in heaven. Israel did not simply take a day off from their work. the universal law was intended to apply to everything that was created. By observing the Sabbath, Moses was reiterating a custom that had been in place from the very beginning, one that established a connection between Israel and the everlasting order that God had established. From the perspective of the Israelites, the Sabbath was a manifestation of their covenant with God. However, the texts that were prohibited expand on this idea to demonstrate that the Sabbath was always intended to be a day of spiritual rejuvenation for all of humanity. It wasn't simply about getting some rest physically. This was about bringing oneself into alignment with the design that God had for time and creation. The book of Leviticus contains a comprehensive set of purity regulations that were given to Moses. These laws cover a wide range of topics, including ritual hygiene, as well as clean and unclean animals. The banned texts, on the other hand, demonstrate that Moses was not the originator of these regulations. Adam, Noah, and Abraham had already been putting them into effect for a very long time before they were written down. In Leviticus 11:15, we find particular instructions on how the Israelites were to maintain their purity, both in their personal life and in their worship. These rules are very specific. Issues such as clean meals, ceremonial washing, and the prevention of defilement through contact with the unclean were among the topics that were addressed by these rules. In spite of this, the Book of Jubilees, specifically Jubilees 720:30, reveals that Moses was already familiar with these commandments protecting purity. In the aftermath of the deluge, they had already been presented to Noah. In point of fact, the books that have been banned uncover the fact that the purity standards were presented to Adam as part of his instructions on how to live a holy life in the presence of God. This set of regulations was handed down from generation to generation in order to guarantee that mankind would be able to keep its spiritual state of cleanliness. Although these regulations for Israel are codified in the Bible, the books that have been forbidden demonstrate that purity has always been a vital component of the covenant that God has with his people. There was more to these regulations than simply adhering to the rules of rituals. The objective of these was to ensure that one lived a life that was dedicated to the purposes of God. Although the sacrificial system that was institutionalized under Moses in Leviticus was an essential component of Israel's worship, it was not the beginning of the worship. According to the texts that were prohibited, the act of offering sacrifices was passed down from Adam to Noah and Abraham, which occurred a significant amount of time before Moses was given the commandments that outlined how to perform sacrifices. The book of Leviticus, chapters 1-7, contains in-depth instructions on how to perform acts of worship and atonement, including the offering of burnt sacrifices, sin offerings, and peace offerings. According to the Book of Jubilees, however, these regulations were a part of an old tradition that had been practiced by the righteous ever since the days of Adam. Jubilees chapter 4:4 relates how Noah provided sacrifices after the flood, exactly as Adam had done after the fall. This is similar to what Noah did after the flood. These ancient sacrifices weren't just rituals of atonement, they were acts of love, expressions of devotion that bridged the human heart to the divine. And contrary to what many believe, the sacrificial system introduced by Moses was not a sudden invention, but a continuation of a sacred tradition far older than Mount Sinai. The forbidden texts, those long hidden from the public eye, reveal that these divine practices were part of God's design from the very beginning. They were given as a way to repair the fractured relationship between humanity and the Creator. From Adam to Noah and from Abraham to Moses, the offering of sacrifice, the honoring of the Sabbath, and the pursuit of purity were not new ideas, they were sacred echoes of an eternal law. Mount Sinai was not the birthplace of these commandments. It was simply the moment they were carved into stone. The laws given to Moses were not a fresh revelation, but the formal recognition of truths already guiding humanity since creation itself. These laws helped shape the identity of God's people, and more importantly, they were the divine blueprint for sustaining a covenant of love and holiness between them and their Creator. By uncovering the veiled wisdom hidden within the forbidden books, especially those once part of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, we begin to see a much deeper thread, one that connects Adam to Moses through a sacred lineage of trust, obedience, and spiritual insight. These eternal commandments are more than laws, they are the heartbeat of an ancient. What are your thoughts on these hidden commandments passed down from Adam to Moses? Share your reflections in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this journey into forbidden wisdom intrigues, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Hidden Teachings for more revelations waiting to be uncovered. Covenant, calling us back to our origins and forward into divine understanding.